Support comes from Empower Missouri, working to fight poverty and secure basic human needs and equal justice for every person in our state through coalition building and advocacy. For more involvement, empowermissouri.org/action.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Later in the show, we'll talk with NPR's Steve Inskeep about how the current state of federal politics compares with some of the darkest times in American history. We'll also discuss why the St. Louis Board of Aldermen held off on dividing up the city's share of the St. Louis Rams settlement. But first, members of the Missouri Republican Party's State Central Committee selected Peter Kinder earlier this month to be the party's chairman. Kinder's election to that post comes at a time of great success. Republicans hold every statewide office and have commanding majorities in the Missouri General Assembly, something that was definitely not the case when Kinder started his political career. And while the power of political parties changed dramatically over the past few decades, Kinder is hoping that his experience as a statewide official and as a longtime political figure can help alleviate factionalism that's plagued the Missouri GOP for years. Joining us now from Cape Girardeau is Peter Kinder, who served 3 terms as Missouri's lieutenant governor and 3 terms representing a Southeast Missouri State Senate district. Chairman Kinder, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you for having me, Jason.
You had been out of the political spotlight since you ran for governor in 2016. I assume enjoying being in the private sector. Why in the world would you want to take on the job as Missouri Republican Party chairman?
Good question. This is not a job I ever thought I would be seeking, not a job I ever coveted. And a few days after the August primary, in which he emerged victorious, then Lieutenant Governor and candidate Mike Kehoe called me and asked me to do this. And I joked with him. I said, "Mike, is that something a friend would ask of another friend? I thought you liked me." But he persisted and said, "Well, I've got to get through the November election anyway. Let's talk after that." So he called after November 5th with the same request, and I said, "I'd like to meet face-to-face," and he said he wanted to do that also. So we met the week of Thanksgiving in St. Louis, by the way, and I agreed to go forward because he felt that I could help unite the party that, as you rightly note, was rather divided in the primary that he won in August and has been divided, especially in the state Senate, for several years. And we're hopeful that we will be able to stitch it back together and get some unity so that we can go forward for the common causes.
Now, before we get into your goals, can you lay out to our listeners what the core responsibilities of the Missouri Republican Party chairman is in the year 2025?
Well, the Republican State Committee, like the Democratic State Committee, is a creature of state government. There are 2 committeemen. I should say there's a committeeman and a committeewoman from each of the 34 senatorial districts for both the Democratic State Committee and the Republican State Committee. So it's a creature of statute in state government, and it is to run the respective state parties. That includes fundraising. It includes whatever staff is going to be hired. Our staff is small, 2 people at present, and we staff up a little more during election years, but in the off years we keep it very lean and mean, and we are about the business of raising money. That is a big responsibility of the job. That also includes communications. Today it includes, beyond the conventional news media, to include social media, outreach, improving our website, which could use some improvement, and ramping up our whole operation to be successful in next year's off-year election.
A moment ago, you talked about GOP factionalism, which we're going to get to in a minute, and mentioned that you took this role to try to help unify the party's common causes. What do you mean by common causes?
Well, when I took the President Pro Tem position 24 years ago, last month, for the first time in 53 years, there were still moderate and pro-choice members of the Missouri legislature serving with me. There no longer are any pro-choice members. We are a pro-life party in what I believe is a pro-life state, and have always believed that. There used to be, when I got to the legislature in 1993, there were dozens and dozens of pro-life Democrats. The ensuing years have seen a sorting out in which they're the pro-abortion party, I would say, and we are the pro-life party. So that's one of our causes. Another one are many of the causes enunciated in Governor Kehoe's State of the State address, in which he emphasized the necessity to deal with crime in the city of St. Louis and throughout the St. Louis region that is plaguing people's lives up there and hurting business growth and recruitment. And another one is Governor Kehoe's stated desire, now I believe being endorsed by members of the General Assembly, to over the next 8 years eliminate Missouri's income tax and place us on a path so that we are like states like Texas, Florida, Tennessee, and other states that have no income tax and that are experiencing explosive growth because they're much more friendly to business than we are currently in Missouri. So that's the way to a rising tide that lifts all boats, to use a phrase JFK used to use. He was a tax cutter also, by the way. And those are a few of our common causes, but there are others.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned technology and improving the website and improving social media presence. What are some of your other goals that you want to achieve as chairman?
Well, I want to do as party chairman, Jason, what I did while in office, in statewide office, and that is take the Republican message to every part of our state, and that emphatically includes urban precincts where Republicans do not have a history of showing up very often. I happen to believe that my effort in the city of St. Louis and in St. Louis County that was rather derided and occasionally laughed at and called a fool's errand by other Republicans is among the reasons why I was the only survivor twice in two presidential election cycles, 2008 and 2012. I was the only winner out of 11 aspiring candidates. And so I think I have a story to tell on that. We want to come into the city of St. Louis, into St. Louis County, and ask, how is it going for you to vote for one party 70-plus straight years? And we think we can make an argument that we have some solutions that can do better. And that it isn't just the crime in the city, it's also the city school system that needs attention.
Yeah, and I could imagine like Democrats in the city of St. Louis hearing that and being like, well, we're looking at the crime statistics and they're going down or in the right direction. And, you know, Republicans haven't really had control of any sort of political office in the city of St. Louis probably since like the 2000s or maybe the early 2010s with one alderman. How are you going to be able to combat those things that they feel like Democratic rule is actually moving the region and the city in the right direction?
Well, the first, the old Chinese proverb, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. We have a candidate for mayor this year, Andrew Jones. We are going to be supporting him to the extent our resources and personal time allows. I'm coming to the city next week, I believe it's Thursday night, for an event supporting Andrew Jones for mayor. we want to get our message out. Now we know the odds are long. We know that Joe Badaracco in 1973 was the last Republican citywide official as president of the Board of Aldermen. And we know the last mayor of St. Louis, who was a Republican, left office in 1949, I believe.
And the last St. Louis County executive who was a Republican was H.R. Milford in 1991, I think. I'm not 100% sure, but continue.
About 35 years ago, he was the last one. And I believe he had been appointed by the council.
He was, but continue, sir.
Not elected. So it's been a long drought, but we think we can make a case that St. Louis is suffering because they're not adopting the policies, the business policies, and the public safety policies that are favored by the rest of the state that is voting so overwhelmingly for Republican leadership.
So let's talk about the factionalism a little bit more. You ended up edging out former state senator Bill Eigel by a pretty small margin, and Eigel was the runner-up in last year's GOP gubernatorial primary. He's now running for St. Charles County executive with several other candidates. Why do you think this race to be chairman was so close, given that, as you kind of mentioned, you have credibility among a lot of different factions within the Missouri Republican Party?
Yeah, Bill Eigel is a very energetic candidate. He ran what I could see was a clean campaign. He went around and visited with people. There are also, Jason, it should be noted, there are 39 new members on that committee out of 68. I had a number of friends who had served on it for years, who just decided that, in some cases for decades, who had been on there, who just decided it's time to move on, let someone else do it. So there was one other factor. Bill Eigel was going around promising people all kinds of things. I'll put you on the executive committee to this person and that person in different parts of the state. I'll put you, I will take care of paying for your county Republican headquarters. I don't believe a state chairman candidate has ever said that to anyone, but that's the kind of thing that was being said, kind of things that were being said by my opponent, and it got him some votes. There's no denying it.
Mm-hmm. And he came of prominence because he was part of this, either the Conservative Caucus or the Freedom Caucus in the Senate. And he kind of was the face of this GOP factionalism we've talked about several times. Is part of your goal here trying to reduce this type of factionalism? Or in a state that has become so Republican that they control everything, is factionalism just inevitable? And you can't really get rid of it as long as you're had all this success legislatively in statewide office.
It is to some degree inevitable. However, it's also a function of personalities. And I'm hopeful that we can move beyond the bitter factionalism of the last 4 years in the Missouri Senate. And early indications of the first 4 weeks or so, maybe 5 now, of the General Assembly are that it is going to be better in the state Senate. So hope springs eternal, and I think we can all pull together. I'm not one for name-calling, bitter accusations against my fellow Republicans, nor for purity tests that some people are advocating. I think we need to recognize that we're all on the same team, pulling in the same direction toward the common goals.
Mm-hmm. In the last minute or so we have here, a listener named Andrea called in to say that your assertion that Missouri is a pro-life state isn't true because of how Missourians voted for Amendment 3 last fall, and Amendment 3 is the measure that enshrined abortion rights in the Constitution. What do you say to Missouri residents like Andrea?
Well, she has a point, given the outcome of that election. It was $40 million spent for Amendment 3 for a narrow victory. I happen to believe that Missourians are not fully informed. In many cases, many of the voters who've supported it are not fully informed of just how radical Amendment 3 is, and that that issue, in my judgment, needs to be revisited and will be revisited. And the last chapter has not been written. We will see.
Yeah, and I do want to just, again, in the last 30 or 40 seconds, I did talk with a lot of people that voted for Amendment 3 that also voted for Donald Trump or Mike Kehoe, and they said that they weren't fooled, and like they knew what they were voting for, and they're just pro-choice Republicans, like you mentioned. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say that we have a case to make, and we will be making it. I'm not saying those individuals were fooled. I'm not saying anybody was fooled. But I do think there was a dearth of information on just how radical it was, and over time we're going to be revisiting that.
Peter Kinder is the chairman of the Missouri Republican Party. He was elected to that post earlier this year by Missouri's GOP Central Committee. Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jason.
When we come back, we'll talk about the ongoing saga over how to spend the city's St. Louis Rams settlement funds. And after that, NPR Morning Edition host Steve Inskeep will be with us. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Members of the St. Louis Board of Aldermen have been at loggerheads over how to divide a roughly $294 million settlement emanating from the departure of the St. Louis Rams. Aldermen have disagreed over what to prioritize, culminating in a Tuesday meeting where members decided to table the matter until after the April general election. To outside observers, shelving this weighty decision could showcase aldermanic dysfunction. Last Friday's meeting featured Board President Megan Green abruptly recessing, and Green faced some heat over since-retracted allegations that aldermen were drinking on the job. But others like Alderwoman Alicia Saunier believe that pressing pause was the right call to get a better outcome for the city.
You know, clearly we needed more conversation around this. And I think when you're talking about almost $300 million, it makes sense that this is something that may take a little bit more time than usual, that you might think that you're ready to move forward and instead need to pause and regroup and recalibrate.
So what happened and where do aldermen go from here? Joining us to talk about the St. Louis Rams settlement saga is Eric Schmid, who covers economic development policy for St. Louis Public Radio. Eric, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks for having me. What a journey it's been.
And what a journey it will be through this segment. And I'd like to invite our listeners into this conversation. If you have a question or comment about the St. Louis Rams settlement saga, give us a call at 314-382-8255. Eric, I know there have been more twists, turns, ups, downs to the situation than we probably have time for, but can you summarize why the board decided against passing any bills this week, divvying up the Rams settlement?
I mean, the short answer is they didn't have the votes.
Okay, why didn't they have the votes, Eric?
They didn't have the votes on a full measure, I think for a variety of reasons. One of them being the Trump administration's decision to say it was going to cut federal funding. That really spooked a lot of aldermen, saying, whoa, we need to pause, we need to slow down. You know, this is a one-time pot of money that is unrestricted. The city can do anything with it. And if the federal government is making these accusations, or not accusations, but is posturing that they might not give city governments like St. Louis money in the future, then maybe we need to rethink how this is going to be spent and not fully allocate it to maybe the ways that we've fully allocated it in these bills are not the best ways in the future given the current climate. And I think also there weren't the votes because there were, certain provisions that, aldermen just didn't agree on or didn't want to support, or, some people wanted something and wanted it in return. It just kind of fell apart.
Now, one big subplot on Tuesday was that some members of the board wanted to pass a bill allocating some of the Rams money for water infrastructure. Joshua Lawrence on Blue Sky asked, the top result of the survey was water. Why did the board go against the Democratic result and put it on the informal calendar on Tuesday?
Yeah, so that was a measure that was being pushed by Ward 1 Alderwoman Ann Schweitzer. Also, Ward 9 Alderman Michael Browning were both involved in wanting to see at least some money go to the water department for water infrastructure. As far as I could tell on Tuesday, the big reason why that faltered or failed was because you had a coalition, a contingent of the North Side aldermen who stood up and said, if you can give money to the water department, then you should give money to North St. Louis. And then there started to be squabbling over like how much money should go to North St. Louis. And it kind of almost became this little political chip. And then it became the decision to just say, well, let's pause on doing anything on this because there was clearly no agreement that was going to be reached.
You mentioned Alderwoman Ann Schweitzer, who represents St. Louis's 1st Ward. Here's what she had to say after Tuesday's meeting.
I think that water is still something people care about. I heard it called a bargaining chip a few times, and I don't think of it like that. I think of it as a basic, crucial city service that we have to provide. I hope that when we come back next session, it'll still be a priority of people on the boards. If I'm able to come back next session, it'll certainly be one of my priorities.
That was 1st Ward Alderwoman Ann Schweitzer talking to Eric Schmid right after the Tuesday meeting. Eric, do you see water infrastructure being a key part of any Rams settlement deal if it emerges?
I mean, I think it would be. For example, I was driving home yesterday and there was a water main break on Grand where, like, right by that new Target, there's a water main break on my street, after the winter storm. I think a lot of people are experiencing the ways that the city's water infrastructure is depleted or needs a lot of work, and during the whole committee process, the director of the city's water division, Patel is his last name, had said there's something like $400 million of money that. $400 million of improvements that the water division needs to make. And so, yes, $40 million to them would not be a lot to cover all of that, but it's like something to get started. With having that allocation in place, then they could start, working on it going forward. To circle back to your question, yeah, I think it will be a priority, especially because both bills that aldermen had been considering had pretty much identical language on money that would go to the water division or the for those improvements. It wasn't something that was contentious between the two pieces of legislation that were in front of aldermen.
And by the way, the director of the Utilities and Public Utilities and Water Commissioner is Niraj Patel.
Yes.
One of the things I noticed is that Board of Aldermen President Green really wanted to create an endowment to help defray the cost of daycare, particularly for city employees. Can you explain what that plan was?
Yeah, so included in the legislation that Alicia Saunier had put forward, which was backed by Green and Mayor Jones, there is a provision to create an endowment fund for childcare and also some youth post-secondary opportunities. And essentially what that would do is take a portion of that Rams money and place it in a fund that would kick off money every year. It'd be the interest that would pay for these, pay to defray the cost of childcare. And that the way that would work is it would only be hundreds of thousands or a few $1 million a year that would actually go toward this program, and it would be something that the city would pilot. So they would start off and start small and see if it worked and see if people liked it, and then maybe try and expand it based off of the principle of the endowment, growing. They could solicit outside investments or donations from the business community or philanthropy or places to try and grow that and say, okay, here we have this pot of money that is, kicking off a little bit every single year that goes to this program, with the idea that it would be a long-term thing. You wouldn't spend down that principle. Instead, presumably you could allocate more money to it and grow that so that the program could grow beyond just city workers, to include potentially everybody in the city. That was a big priority, but it came up a lot in discussion, and the question that aldermen had was like, how can we even support and sustain this? And I think, where the communication was, challenging on that was to, really be clear about, it's not like we're, giving $30 million to just stand up a new program. It would be, we're setting aside $30 million so that the money it throws off every single year can start a new program that we could potentially grow in the future.
Let's go to Scott from St. Louis. Scott, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Oh, hi. Hey, how are you doing? I think that money should be used equally for all citizens of St. Louis. I don't think any one subset of group people should get more benefit out of that money than another group. We have terrible roads. We've got thousands of water lines that need to be replaced, plus other major infrastructure. There's terrible roads in North St. Louis. There's terrible roads in Central St. Louis. There's terrible roads in South St. Louis. I think that money should be 100% used to benefit all people equally. And I'm completely against any of that money being used for childcare for city workers. That's completely unfair. So anyway, that's basically what I got to say about it.
Scott, thank you so much for your comment. Eric, what do you make of Scott's discussion right there?
Yeah, I mean, that's how, what Scott says is how I'm sure a lot of people in the city feel, that putting a portion of this money that the city won to specifically advantage a subset of people who live here is inherently unfair. I also think that the city is down on workers. They're, one of the big things in the idea portal was giving city workers a raise, and that was never on the table because.
And I actually talked with St. Louis Mayor Tashara Jones about that last year, and I basically said that is not a good idea.
Yeah, it's one-time money.
Because it's one-time money, and she agreed with me.
Mm-hmm. And so this idea around providing, defraying the cost of childcare for city workers could be seen as a additional benefit to say, okay, if you're, how can we bolster the city workforce, which is aging, which there are a lot of open positions and positions that haven't been filled? Would this be a way to get people back in the workforce, or entice them to move here, or entice them to consider investing their time and effort and resources and money into this community? Of course, now that's off the table because no bill actually came to fruition. But I think, our listener in Scott has a good point. There were people during public comment who stood up and said, I don't agree with this. I would say also a lot more people stood up and said childcare is incredibly expensive, prohibitively expensive, and it is keeping me out of the workforce, and I don't want to be out of the workforce.
I can agree that childcare is expensive as the father of 3 small kids. Now, we got a couple of questions about the timeline for allocating these funds. For example, Go Luby on Blue Sky asks, does the board have to decide how to spend all the money now? And Braden STL on Instagram says, we understand that this delay will push projects back for years, and that's exactly the problem. Why, how can we be responsible and have timely allocations of these funds when so many people need it now? So can you talk about is there a timeline on this, and is the delay going to hurt, trying to solve some of these problems that aldermen want to solve?
Yeah. The answer to, is there a timeline on this? No, there isn't. The money right now is just in a interest-bearing account. It's going to continue to grow. It started off as $250 million. Now it's up to $300 million, and that's just because of it, growing because of interest and going back into that. So there isn't a timeline that aldermen need to spend it, unlike the American Rescue Plan Act tranche of dollars, which had a timeline on it. In terms of whether or not a delay will mean more city services don't happen, that is true. The money is in the bank. It is not allocated to departments to fix streets, to invest in water infrastructure, to do neighborhood or community development. Whatever the proposals are that aldermen had to actually spend this, those aren't happening, and it will take time for those to actually ramp up once they allocate it in the future. As soon as they get back from the spring elections.
Let's go to Nick. Nick, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you. I have two suggestions. One would be buying back firearms from people that mainly live in the city, paying them for it. The program's been in place before. I think that'd be a good way to spend the money. And the other thing would be to just literally leave it in the interest-bearing account and use the $20 million or whatever it is a year on certain projects. And that way it'll quell some of the disruption over what to do with the money right away.
Nick, thank you so much for your comments. And Eric, before we let you go, can we take a step back and talk about the public engagement component of what happened? Because there are a lot of people like Nick that have had these individualized ideas. There are other commenters on social media saying, why don't we give it to SLPS? Like, how did the public engagement play into what people proposed?
What the aldermen proposed?
Yes.
Yeah. So those public comments, as I understand it, really shaped the way that the bill that Alicia Sonnier drafted and filed, that was backed by Board President Green and also Mayor Tashara Jones. It was the way that they messaged it. It was, we put this idea portal together. We had people vote on this. We gathered a whole bunch of feedback, tens of thousands of touch points and all of that stuff. And that's what informed the priorities that are laid out in that piece of legislation. So they would say, we asked the public what they wanted. This is the, the aggregate results, and that's what the bill is organized around. Of course, did the public input work? It's hard to say whether it did or didn't because we don't have a bill path.
Yeah. But before we go, I do want to ask about something that popped up over the weekend, which sucked up a lot of my Saturday. Green put out posts on Facebook alleging that aldermen were drunk during Friday's meetings. She singled out Alderman Joe Vollmer, who vigorously denied he drank anything but coffee during that meeting, and Green apologized to Vollmer. I listened to that whole meeting. I didn't hear any reference to that. Is the whole talk of aldermanic inebriation just water under the bridge right now?
It might be. I mean, it didn't really come up on Tuesday. That the feeling in the chamber was, or in the chambers, was pretty subdued. I mean, it was just kind of people moving procedurally through and not getting very worked up as had been the case on the Friday meeting that was recessed.
Yeah. Okay. One other question before I let you go. Who do you think will win, the Chiefs or the Eagles this weekend?
Oh, can't they both lose?
Well, I hope they both have fun.
Yes.
Neither of us are actually fans of
either
the Chiefs or the Eagles. I'm a Bears fan. You're a Denver Broncos fan, correct?
I don't even know who I root for anymore.
But are you going to root for, them to just have a great time?
I hope they have a great time. I won't be watching. That's how I'm voting.
Okay, but back to city politics. What will you be watching in the coming weeks?
I will be watching to see. Well, Board President Green has suggested that she could call a special session during the election break. So maybe that happens. Who knows? I will be watching to see who wins the race for mayor, particularly
because that's a big elephant in the room, and comptroller too, because they have say over the Board of Estimate and Apportionment.
Yeah. So it may change the dynamics of what an eventual bill or what an eventual spending package actually looks like, because if we have a different mayor or a different comptroller with different priorities or different opinions on what things should look like, then it influences, presumably what legislation would make it to the desk. Because even if a bill makes it through the Board of Aldermen to the mayor still has to sign it into law. And if there is a different mayor, there will be different priorities, and that will filter in.
Eric Schmid covers economic development for St. Louis Public Radio. Eric, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. One of the most rote phrases uttered during the last 5 or 6 years is how we're living in unprecedented times. And there's some truth there. None of us experienced a global pandemic like COVID-19 or the shocking insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, 2021. But America's relatively brief existence is littered with plenty of things that resemble current events in 2025, especially when it comes to stark political divisions. NPR's Steve Inskeep wrote Differ We Must, How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America, about how Abraham Lincoln dealt with ideological divergence as he ascended to the presidency. We talked with Inskeep about the release of his book in 2023, and now upon the release of his book in paperback this month, he's coming back to St. Louis to talk about it again. In an event presented in partnership with the Missouri Historical Society and St. Louis Public Radio, Inskeep will be at the St. Louis County Library's Clark Family Branch this Wednesday at 7 p.m. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Steve Inskeep, one of the hosts of NPR's Morning Edition and Up First. Steve, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you. Glad to be here, Jason. Thanks for the invitation.
Your book, Differ We Must, How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America, was released in 2023. Today's political environment feels and is very different with the new administration.
I can hear the change in your tone of voice. Please proceed. Go ahead.
It seems like you've done this radio thing for a while. Are you thinking about your book tour now in different ways that you might have not have thought of in 2023?
Well, clearly a lot of things have changed in terms of who the president is and what the agenda is, but a few things haven't changed. We still live under the same small r Republican system of government. We have a republic. It's democratic. There are checks and balances. There are different branches of government, and they are called upon to fight it out, and we as citizens are called upon to participate. All of that stuff was true in 2023. I would assert that all of that stuff is true in 2025. I think that the new Trump administration is being fairly explicit that they want to change the accepted rules of the game, and they argue that they can do so within the bounds of the Constitution. Democrats are arguing that they are vastly exceeding a president's powers and authority, and the courts are beginning to referee on that. That is the system that we have and that we have had. And I appreciated your introduction. My study of history reminds me that human nature doesn't change much, that our basic system of government has yet to change very much. The events do change. We're not in the middle of a new civil war, as Abraham Lincoln was, but we can learn from that time.
Well, you probably gathered, I love American history. One of my greatest achievements in my entire life is getting a 5 on the AP US test when I was in high school.
Congratulations. Isn't that the top grade? I think it is.
It is. And I also got a 5 on AP Euro, too, which was much harder.
I sometimes got 5s in school, but that was on a 100-point scale. So please proceed. Go on.
I often find commonalities with things that happened decades or centuries ago to provide context to the present state of our country. So with the caveat that no time period in American history is identical, can you point to a period of time in the United States' history that is similar to 2025?
Yeah, well, let's make the comparison with the Civil War period. The essential thing that I ended up writing about with Abraham Lincoln, who, as you know, has been written about a little bit before, was his effort to build political coalitions. Doris Kearns Goodwin has a great book about Lincoln that became a movie that tries to focus on his team of rivals, the individuals who were on his side, who also wanted to be president, thought they should have been president. I attempted a slightly different task in figuring out how Lincoln dealt not just with those individuals who were basically on his side, but people who were on the other side or on seemingly no side, and how he tried to bring them into his coalition or try to outmaneuver or manage them if he couldn't bring them to his side. I think that was the essential problem of democracy then. Lincoln succeeded to the extent that he kept the majority of states behind the Union in the Civil War, and as a result they had more population, more money, a bigger army, and they won the war. The war was a kind of election by other means, and the majority ruled. That building of coalitions is our central challenge today, and we just went through a coalition-building election. I think the Democrats believed, until a few months ago, that they had the broader coalition, that they had the wider collection of different kinds of people and beliefs that they could bring together under one tent of supporting the Constitution as they see it and supporting the United States as they see it. And they found out that in this particular election, it was Republicans who built a slightly bigger, very, very slightly, but bigger coalition and brought different kinds of people into their tent, got more, for example, minority voters than many people expected them to do, and prevailed. And now Democrats face a challenge again. It's their turn to try to see if they can rebuild a larger coalition in a giant country where we are all free and where we all have a voice. And we're going to not have all the same opinion. It'd be terrifying if we all had the same opinion. That coalition building is what it's all about.
One thing that was definitely not around in the 1850s and 1860s was social media platforms. And there's plenty of anecdotal evidence and polling data out there that news consumers are getting information on places like TikTok, Instagram, X, Facebook, rather than traditional news outlets. I assume most people got news in the 1850s and 60s with newspapers, since radio didn't exist then. How do you think that's affecting how people view politics now?
Well, I think that there is some information for me in history. I think the fundamental thing that's happened to us is that information is coming at us a lot faster than it was, and we don't often know what to believe. And even if the things that we're told on social media are true, are they relevant? Are they the most important thing? Are they the only thing? Lincoln's era had a similar challenge. There was a dramatic increase in the amount and the speed of communications. Weekly newspapers became daily newspapers. Railroads carried those newspapers across the country from one city to another. The telegraph sped news from one city to another almost instantaneously. This had never happened before. When you read the initial accounts of the telegraph, which I put in an earlier book from 1844, the newspaper accounts of what was going on are a little like people gazing in wonder at the early years of Facebook. Wow, we can get all of these opinions from the other side of the world instantly. Those are the kinds of things people were saying then. It affected American politics at that time in real time, and I give examples. Policymakers were getting instant, emotional, divisive, partisan news events and faced pressure to respond to them instantly rather than thoughtfully. And that was, I believe, a divisive force. And we've had our own wave of that in an even more extreme way in recent times.
Well, to continue on this theme of commonalities, I've noticed that when I was watching the inauguration of President Trump, there were all these social media platform barons on the platform with him. And that brings to mind old school newspaper publishers who got directly involved in politics. William Randolph Hearst is the obvious example there. How would these tech barons' attempts to influence federal policy and politics compare to how media executives of old attempted to showcase their influence with politicians?
There really is something unusual about having such very wealthy people on the inaugural stage, and we have to decide how we want to interpret that. Were they showing their power and influence? Were they showing that they have been overawed and captured by the new administration? We've heard both interpretations on NPR, by the way, and I think it depends on the particular mogul you're focusing on, and it also depends on the lapse of time, who actually prevails here in this struggle. But it's unusual to have that very close and public display. It is not unusual to have rich people in the proximity of government. It is not unusual to have people with business interests who want to influence the United States government. It totally happened in Lincoln's time, and there were media figures in Lincoln's time who were very powerful. The first one who comes to mind is James Gordon Bennett, who had this mass circulation newspaper in New York, the New York Herald. And if you go back and read the old accounts of the New York Herald, a lot of it is like really good, really interesting, really vividly written. And a lot of it is also like nasty and cynical and racist and unfair. And hard to know what to make of it. And Bennett himself was a tremendously influential figure. People who criticize the media are not wrong that the media can be very influential and very politically powerful. And it does create a challenge for those of us who are trying to provide valid information for our audience, regardless of their politics, so that they can make up their own minds about things. That is a very special challenge that has never been the unanimous function of the media writ large. And right now, I would say the mainstream media are and include some of the cable TV partisan channels and some of the big YouTubers and so forth. I mean, Joe Rogan is the mainstream media. He's got a huge audience. We're just trying to do something a little bit different, which is to go see things for ourselves and not just talk about them in a studio, and to go learn facts and get different and opposing points of view about something before we pronounce any particular opinion about it, and to make sure that we convey to you, the listener, a bit of information so that you can do your job as a citizen. We're citizens, and we're trying to inform our fellow citizens.
I do want to talk about another phenomenon that has emerged, especially after Trump was inaugurated, and that's news fatigue. Because non-journalists I've talked to have been pretty exhausted about politics and current events and have coped with paring down how much news they consume. Maybe they watch the Grammys or the NBA instead of NPR or reading the New York Times. What do you think about people who do this?
It's totally understandable. There's a lot to take in. There's a lot of stress, and a lot has gone on in people's lives over the last number of years. Each presidential election has been dramatic and stressful, the last several of them. The pandemic was huge and dramatic and stressful. The economic stresses of these times have been difficult. The speed of change in technology has been dramatic and difficult. So you totally understand why people check out. I think two things come to mind. I will blame, quote unquote, the media for some of that, because I do think that, and I would include social media people in this, come to think of it. I mean, this is some mainstream reporters, but it's also social media figures, YouTubers, Instagram influencers, all kinds of people. There is a tendency to wildly overstate every single development as being the end of humanity, the end of civilization, an utter disaster. There is something about our media infrastructure that favors bad news and proclamations of bad news and invocations of fear and other emotions like that. And people do get tired of it. And I think they deserve to get tired of it. They should be tired of it. I don't want to say NPR really, to be honest with you, but those of us who are collectively talking to the public have cried wolf a few too many times, many too many times. And I think that people are understandably turning away from that. At the same time, I think that we all have a job as citizens to pay attention, and we do need to pay regular and constant attention because we are the ones who maintain our own freedom. Nobody else really does that for us.
Well, and my last question for you, you mentioned the fire hose of news.
Yeah.
How do you as a journalist deal with this deluge of information and combine it with what I just mentioned of people being kind of fatigued about news and do the most effective job possible in informing the public?
I try to apply the same format to all kinds of news that I have learned to apply to plane crashes. We had a tragic collision the other day, a collision of a jetliner and a helicopter. Many, many years ago, when I was a reporter, I covered transportation, and so I did a number of plane crashes. And I learned to be patient, to not jump to instant conclusions, and to stop trusting people who jump to instant conclusions, because plane crashes tend to be very complicated. There are all sorts of safety systems, and typically multiple things have to go wrong for the plane to go down. If just one thing goes wrong, usually the plane stays up because it's redundant and it's very, very safe. And it's a matter of science and investigation and sometimes human nature and social science even, to figure out how a particular crash took place, and that takes time. And I try to apply that patience as a news consumer also. I want to pay attention to the media that give a thoughtful look at something, that return to the story a day later or a week later or a year later to see how it might look a little bit different. And that do not proclaim conclusions instantly based on little or no information. That's how I try to weed it down as a citizen, whatever the story is.
Steve Inskeep is one of the hosts of NPR's Morning Edition and Up First, and he'll be at the St. Louis County Library's Clark Family Branch this Wednesday at 7 p.m. to discuss Differ We Must, How Lincoln Succeeded in a Divided America. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
The Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wissentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. Audio engineering and sound design by Aaron Dorr. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.